Okay, so this is something I've been looking forward to doing for the last few days now. It's kind of rare that there's usually a bit more intensity to making a video, it seems, nowadays. I want to talk about three books. Three books. It's not so much a book review; it's book recommendations. And this came about because of a video that I'd made, and included an article by Steven Pinker on rates of violence, and that led to a comment about whether I'd read his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, and I said that I hadn't read that, but I had read The Blank Slate, which is also by Steven Pinker, and then that led to a comment in return. Be really interested to know some of the books you'd read and what you thought of them and what recommendations you've had of the books that you've read. So what I thought I'd do is start off with this video with three books, and then maybe do some others, just picking some of the books that have most interested me over the past decade, why they've interested me, what I've got out of them, and maybe a few anecdotes to go along with it. So in this video, I will start off with The Blank Slate because it's an interesting and controversial book, and it segues nicely to how this came about. I then want to look at David Beerling's The Emerald Planet, which is about the evolution of plants. Which sounds, it's like, I think I'll probably skip that one, Jim. Don't, because it's a much more interesting book than it sounds, and it's a lot much bigger in scope than it sounds just from what I've said there. And then finally, Paul Davies, the scientific popularist, or popular writer, I should say, popular author, and his book, The Eerie Silence, a bit of a sort of diversionary book from him. His work, I think he's the chairman of the SETI post-detection department, or at least was for a few years there. His work on aliens and UFOs and all the stuff regarding that. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So I'll start off with The Blank Slate, which I've got a copy of this. I've got a copy of The Emerald Planet, but the Paul Davies book I borrowed off my father, so I haven't actually got that one to hand. So The Blank Slate, quite a big book, 400 odd pages in there, a bucket load of references at the end, and a controversial book when it's written, and it has been ever since, and it's been a subject of quite a lot of criticism of Steven Pinker on accounts of his ideological opponents, and quite a lot of praise with regard to his ideological bedfellows. It's a subject, it involves subjects that polarise people, and therefore the impact of the book and the way that people view the book has been similarly polarised. One of the objections against the book is that what he proposes is that the sort of overriding paradigm in the social sciences for quite a number of decades, probably for the last century, has been this idea of the tabula rasa, the blank slate, that the nativistic components are virtually non-existent within human beings. Maybe they are within everything else in the animal kingdom, but for some unexplained reason, when it comes down to human beings, culture is everything, learned behaviour is everything. We are ultimately plastic in our nature, and the environment shapes us almost in the entirety. Now, one of the criticisms is that he overstates that, and he makes out as if that has been much more ubiquitous in the social sciences than it actually is. And that may well be true that he overstates that. But one of the ways in which this criticism is levelled at him as if he's just kind of plucked it out of his arse. And when you read the book, it is clear that that is not the case. One thing, if there's one thing that he does do in each and every touch and turn in this book, is to give you example after example after example after example of things that people in those fields have said, of positions that they've taken, and they're espousing why they have taken those positions. And in this case, that includes the sort of ideological pre-commitments that they've had and the reasons why. Once he gets through the first few chapters, he has a section of the fears that people have had. He labels them the fears of inequality, the fear of imperfectibility, the fear of determinism, and the fear of nihilism. And in turn, he deals with those things and then shows people that were respected in those fields effectively saying things along the lines of, well, if X is to be true, or if we accept that X is true, or believe X, then that could lead us to believing Y. Right, as if that's a scientific reason not to believe it, as if we should turn our face away from researching certain things or accepting certain points, because if we do, it might lead us to some kind of uncomfortable truth. And of course, that is something that most of us would rail very strongly against. But it doesn't just make those claims, he evidences those claims. And so I think whatever side of these debates that you fall upon, this is a really, really interesting thing to read with regard to that, because clearly people within these fields do hold to these positions, and that is surely something that we should rail against. One of the most interesting thing at the end of the books is he has these chapters which he calls hot buttons, and he deals with politics, violence, gender, children, and the arts. And effectively he's asking, looking at each one of these things in turn, is there a nativistic component, a genetic or an innate component that affects our behaviour, either as individuals or as on a statistical basis when viewed as some kind of group, or is there not? Is it all just, is everything accounted for by culture and by learning? Okay, so those are the things that he looks at, and there's some very, very interesting material in all of those. I think given the kind of the discussions that we have, a lot of people would perhaps be interested in the gender chapter there, and he makes some quite interesting points. And one of the points that he makes with regard to that, and also with regard to the fears, is this problem that he sees, which is this idea that if we were to find some kind of biological difference between, say, men and women in the way that they think, or in their preferences, or in their abilities, or between different ethnic groups with regard to their abilities, that in some ways that would justify bigotry, that it would in some ways justify sexism or racism. And this is one of the central points that I took from his book, which I thought was very well made. The first thing is that he said is that really we shouldn't be judging people, when we judge them as individuals, we shouldn't be judging them based on the average characteristics of some group to which they belong. We should be judging them as individuals. And the second thing he said is if we found our principle of equality on the basis that men and women are indistinguishable with regards to these traits, that people of different ethnicities are indistinguishable with regard to these different traits, then it's a very, very precarious path that we walk down. Because if it happens to be falsified at any point now or at any time in the future, then the entire edifice upon which we've built our principles of equality crumble at the same time. Whereas if instead we have this principle of treating people as individuals rather than as some average characteristic of some group that they belong to, then none of that really matters. You know, the fact that Chinese people tend to be shorter in stature than the average Westerner doesn't preclude you from putting a 6'8" Chinese guy into a basketball team on the grounds that, well, most Chinese people are pretty short, right? So why should it impact on any of these other things? We treat people in a meritocratic way according to their own skills. The politics section was another that I found quite interesting, and this will probably bore you to tears if you're already familiar with this theory, but he gives you this idea of something that had always been a little bit of a curio to me, which was the sort of strange mix of things which make up right-wing politics and the strange mix of things which make up left-wing politics, because it's not as if one political wing is for restrictions and the other one is for freedoms. It's actually a lot more complicated than that. The left traditionally is for individual freedoms, but for restrictions placed on corporations and groups, and the right is the exact opposite. Freedoms and promotion of corporation and groups, but restrictions on the individual. And I always kind of thought, what would tie that together? Well, the suggestion that he gives here, and I'm not saying it's a Pinker original, he's picking up on other ideas in this book that all fit along a theme, is this idea that it's based upon how you view human nature. So effectively, the left-wing perspective is a very positive view of human nature, that effectively what it's saying is that people are basically good and will do the right thing. They'll do the thing that's right for them and that's right for society, and they're diligent and they're hardworking, etc., etc. And the right-wing perspective is bollocks, are they? Not everybody, some people will work hard, some people are community minded, but there are enough people. We are over the critical mass of people within a society that, left to their own devices, they'll drag the fucking rest of us down. So the result of that is that from the political right, you have to place restrictions on individuals, because if you just treat them, if you say, well, if you haven't got a job, we'll give you whatever you need, whatever resources, don't worry about it, we'll give you whatever you need until you diligently go and sort yourself out, right? That some people, a sufficiently large number of people, will say, well, that'll do for me, I'll just keep taking out of the system and live on the system. As far as I'm concerned, great, you keep fucking working on my behalf. Whereas the left-wing perspective is, now, most people wouldn't do that. Most people want to contribute, they want to be part of the collective, and they want to help everybody else out. So that is the perspective on the individual level. And then on the group level, the left-wing perspective is we can all group together, nationalise things, everybody works together for the communal good, and it's all going to work really well. Whereas the right-wing perspective is, no, they fucking won't. People will just toss it off. They'll take longer and longer tea breaks. Their productivity, their output will go down. Management will become less effective. There'll become more and more bureaucracy, procedures that don't work. It'll be like sort of like in the genome. It'll be like the kind of spurious non-coding readings of the genome that just kind of populate, and it's difficult. They don't get weeded out because there's no reason for it to get weeded out, because they're not transcribed and they're not phenotypically expressed, so they just exist there in the genome. It's a little bit like that. These things will happen and there's no mechanism by which they will be removed. Whereas businesses, corporations, if you have competition, people are still shits, and those businesses will still be shits, but it's shit against shit. People are competing, and so they have to put their cup of tea down and fucking do something, otherwise the other people will be putting their cups of tea down and doing something. They'll be less efficient and they will be caught out. So that competitive element keeps everybody keen, keeps everybody keeps everybody working to a kind of set of rules. So that's kind of how that worked, and I found that really, really interesting. And it did kind of make sense to me, that, and it still does. This is several years down the line, that still makes sense to me. Admittedly, there has to be more to it than that, because on that grounds alone, and taking my own cynical perspective of people, that would put me somewhere far to the right of Adolf fucking Hitler. And yet at the same time, I'm a firm proponent of a welfare state and of healthcare that's free at the point of delivery. So there's obviously more factors involved in actually how we then take that ideological perspective and come up with a practical application of it than there is just of that. But that's just one example of some of the interesting stuff that is in that book. It is full of interesting bits, whether you agree with that kind of perspective or not. And so I recommend that book. The second book that I want to recommend is by David Beerling. It's a shorter book of about 250 pages, something like that. And it is called The Emerald Planet. Now, one of the things that I really love about this book, we've all read books on evolution, haven't we? Whether it's on evolutionary theory, the modern evolutionary synthesis, or whether it's on the mechanisms by which evolution works, either on the individual level or on the genetic level, or whether it's the actual mechanisms that are involved at the cell level and meiosis and the way that genes are transcribed, etc., etc., and the way that bodies are built. And I'll probably recommend a book to do with that, actually. Really, really good popular science book on that in one of the videos. But we've all read those books, but nearly always it kind of boils us down to animals, doesn't it? It's nearly always about animals, because that's the interesting shit. Animals, not plants. And yet in terms of the story of the planet, plants have played a bigger role in shaping our environment, in terraforming, if you like, than animals have. And that was why I read that book, because I knew that this book would have a bigger scope than you would perhaps think just straight off the bat. But it turns out that there is so much more in this book than you think, because to understand the story of the evolution of plants is to understand the planet, and to understand the planet you need to understand lots and lots of other things, such as the way in which we view the planet now with the ice caps, of course. That's a very, very modern thing. It's only about the last 30 million years, something like that, that we've had ice on both polar caps. And that's not normally been the situation. We've not had ice caps on the planet. And yet that is the vision we have, not just for our planet, but what a planet should look like, right? A solid, not a gas giant, but a solid planet should have these ice caps. So that's kind of interesting in itself. But there's so many other areas that it touches upon. You need an understanding to understand plants. You need to understand, obviously, the atmospheric carbon cycle, but you also need to understand the geological carbon cycle, which is ultimately which will bail us out of whatever damage we do to the environment with global warming. Admittedly, we may have to wait 20 or 30 million years for that cycle to have gone sufficiently far round, but that is what bails the planet out and keeps it a nice temperate planet that it is. You need to understand these things to understand the impact of plants, but once you understand the impact of plants, then you start to put all these other different bits. And there's lots and lots of tales in this book that were new to me. One of the best that I didn't know was that in the Carboniferous, when oxygen levels were so high, that is why you had these why are those great big insects then, and we don't have these great big insects? Well, insects have these very rudimentary circulatory systems. They don't have blood vessels like we have. It just kind of, the blood squishes around their body. It's very, very inefficient. And that limits the size that insects can be. It's the oxygen transportation around the body, not the physical strictures of having an exoskeleton or anything like that. It's the oxygen bullshit, right? But in the Carboniferous, oxygen levels were a lot higher than they are now. And because of that, insects could sustain these great big bodies, and duly as the Carboniferous started to end, oxygen levels started to go down, the insects shrunk at the same time. That was something that I never knew about before I read this book, and that was fascinating. And another interesting thing with regard to reading this book is that I read this book on holiday, right? I read this book in Turkey, Oludenice, on the beach, lovely beach, and I'm laid on that beach, blistering, baking sunshine on that beach, and there's a chapter in this book about Antarctica and about Captain Robert Scott and his trip there, man-hauling his sleds with his crew to the South Pole. Fantastic tale. In fact, it was such I so enjoyed reading that the next summer I read Ranulph Fiennes' account of the same trip, and that is from somebody who has actually man-hauled across Antarctica. Set the record straight in that book on a lot of the misconceptions and lies told about Scott and his expedition. That was just an amazing book to read in terms of what it made you conjure up, the images it conjured up. But I'm reading about Scott trekking across the Antarctic plateau at 8,000 feet, dying effectively because you are dying there, because the air's thinner, because man-hauling means that you are burning more calories every day than you can take in food. It doesn't matter how much food that you eat, you are burning more calories than the human body can process per day. So you are having to cannibalize your body day on day on day on day, and there's nothing that you can do to stop that from happening. And I'm reading about that and the bitter, terrible conditions that are slowly killing them, and eventually did kill all of them. And I am laid on a beach, sweating my bollocks off and having to take dips in the beautiful ocean to try and cool down every so often. And that was a really surreal experience to read that whilst in that totally different environment there. Of course, the Scott story's in there because he found some fantastic fossils of plants in Antarctica, which was fundamental in making us think about how the fuck did they get there? How were plants growing there? And that was one of the evidences with regards to what was called continental drift and then became plate tectonics, of course, as well as improving our understanding of the evolution of plants around the world, and the way in which the continents actually linked up, as well as the fact that they were moving. So this touches on so many things, this book there, and for a book that's about 250 pages long, there is a shitload of stuff in there. So I recommend that book as well. The last book that I want to recommend then is Paul Davies's The Eerie Silence. So The Eerie Silence is not a book that I can wave under your nose because it's a book that I borrowed off my father. And I have a lot to thank my father for my love of science and all this kind of stuff, because he exposed me to a lot of this when I was young. Thanks, Dad, for that, as well as for lending me Paul Davies's book on this occasion. And I think the first Paul Davies, I had a look at his list of books, and there's certainly 6 of his books, possibly 7 that I've read. The first one that I read was God and the New Physics. I was 12 years old when that book was released. it's probably about 13 or 14 where I read the book, because it was a book that my dad had bought, and he kind of pushed me into books on relativity and quantum mechanics and all that kind of stuff, and I lapped those kind of books up in my early teen years. And I've always kind of liked Paul Davies as an author. He has a slightly kind of religious bent to some of it, in terms of he wants to compare science to religion, and sometimes he's a little bit too accommodationist for some people. But I find his readings really, perhaps being European and not feeling at all threatened by that, not being able to just take that into account. Maybe for some Americans where it's more of a function of your day-to-day society, that might grate a little bit more perhaps. But for me, it wasn't really a problem. And I've enjoyed his books, but this was a bit of a departure, this book, into UFOs. Rather than dealing with physics and all that kind of stuff, he's dealing with UFOs. And that is because he was made chair of the SETI Post-Detection Committee. The SETI is the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, which has gone on in many different ways, shapes and forms for quite a long time now. Now, I don't know if he's still the chair of that committee, but he was at the time of writing this book. And there's some very, very interesting things, both on the practical level and also on the kind of theoretical level, that this book deals with. One of the things that I found most interesting, thinking largely in terms of the kind of things that conspiracy theatrical kind of ways of looking at things, that probably isn't even a word, theatrical, but the kind of things that conspiracy theorists would come out with, is this idea of governments. If aliens are in contact with us and they're suppressing all this information, right, they won't let us know about it. When Paul Davies took on this role, one of the first things that he did, or claims he did, I suppose the conspiracy theorists would say, well, he's part of the inside mob, so he would say that he's a government stooge or something. But what he says is one of the first things that he did was contact governments and say, if we find this information, what do you want us to do? How do we contact you? What is the method by which we inform the United States government, the British government? And he said that the overwhelming thing he got back from his response was that they'd not even really fucking thought about it. It was no, right, you've got to let us know first, and then we're going to send men down in dark glasses to erase your memory. It was, well, I don't know, we'll probably read about it in the fucking papers or whatever. It was just like a total sort of, like they'd not even considered what we're doing. It wasn't like they'd got all these well set out plans for suppressing it. And then as he goes on to talk about things that had little anomalies in the data that have come up, they've got out into the public domain often before governments would have a chance to do anything about it. And the idea that such data could be suppressed nowadays is kind of ridiculous given the way that the societies work now, because this information is shared throughout the scientific community quite readily with regard to projects like SETI, and then it gets out in there's no real method, there's no mechanism of suppressing this thing. But he also talks a lot about aliens and what we would expect of aliens, the realistic proposition or lack of aliens perhaps being able to travel to us. He talks about that, which is very interesting, and of course he can use his knowledge of physics with regard to that. He talks about how we expect to detect aliens, which is really interesting, and how we always imagined that just the same way as we broadcast our TV, and that now we're at that point of broadcasting that forevermore will be detectable. That's kind of how we've envisaged aliens as being, right? So any that's got to our stage, we'll be able to watch their fucking TV or whatever. And yet it's only a few decades on, and already we're gradually plunging our planet slowly into radio silence again, because broadcasting is not a very efficient way of doing things. There's no need to beam your signals out there when you can beam it so much more efficiently in the way that we do with the internet, etc. So that kind of shows some naivety on our part in what we were expecting, and it may well be that every civilization, sentient civilization, gets to a very, very narrow window where they broadcast, and maybe that only lasts from a few years to a few decades to a few centuries, and then blang, that disappears again as they discover better ways of doing things, more efficient ways of doing things. He also talks about the dangers of aliens and how naive we are. You know, even if you imagine these aliens that have the technology, if such technology is even physically possible to realistically get to our planet, you know, they can design Dyson spheres And about the closest that we are is the Dyson ball vacuum cleaner. And what a gulf there is between a Dyson ball and a Dyson sphere. They can be that much more technologically advanced, but already at our level, at the Dyson ball level of advancement, we're moving away from a situation where resources are the most valuable commodity. Already information is becoming the most valuable commodity. So when you have an alien civilization that has got the technology to be able to get to our planet, it's really naive to think that they're going to be coming to us looking for our natural resources when already we're moving beyond that kind of realm. If they're going to be interested in anything, it's going to be in information, or it's going to be in studying us with having as little impact on us as is possible, or it could be much more likely, he suggests, that it could be in a benevolent capacity than anything else, because there's no point not being benevolent unless you have something that something else wants. And as it's highly unlikely that we have anything that they would want, then they would have no other interest in us other than to be benevolent or just to fucking ignore us and carry on to somewhere else. So lots and lots of different things discussed in that book. A lot better than I've managed to garble it out now. But it certainly challenged a lot of the preconceptions I had. So that's 3 books that I think provide a really good challenge in different ways. The Blank Slate by Steven Pinker, David Beerling's The Emerald Planet, and finally, bit of a sort of curveball from him, Paul Davies. There's 3 books. I'll come back with another 3 books in a month or 2. Thank you for watching, and bye for now.